1990s Vegas was seen as the push to become family-friendly. From the Adventure Dome to MGM Grand Adventures, to hotel lobbies being transformed into entertainment anyone could enjoy. The first attempt to offer something for the whole family, however, would open in the mid-80s. A place that success and failure would define the family era of Vegas. One that shared all the same troubles of nearly every single family attraction trying to transform the city, and just another that was closed to be replaced with a resort casino on land that still sits abandoned.
It was wet, it was wild, and it came to an end when the property owners decided the location was too valuable for a water park.
After George Millet failed to turn Seven Seas in Arlington, Texas into a water park, the first Wet 'n Wild opened in Orlando in 1977. It took a few years for the new Oceans of Fun to find its footing and create a profit, but it would eventually become a huge hit. It wouldn't be long until the company would expand with a second Wet 'n Wild. It would take all of the things that they had learned at the original and transport them to Texas. The $22 million Wet 'n Wild Arlington opened in 1983. Both the original park and Arlington's would be designed by George Walsh. None of the mistakes that troubled the original park's first years were present this time, and the second park in the Wet 'n Wild chain had an extremely smooth opening year. Shortly after, the company's next opportunity would be calling. Wet 'n Wild would be heading to Las Vegas, when the company would receive a call from a well-known Las Vegas real estate company, the Howard Hughes Corporation. Howard Hughes had moved to Vegas permanently in the 60s, when he arrived on Thanksgiving Day 1966 and rented the entire top 2 floors of the Desert Inn. When he was asked to leave to make room for the high rollers coming for New Year's Eve, he started negotiations to buy the resort, the first of many which would later become his empire. They would go on to purchase many hotels and nearly every vacant area of land on the Vegas Strip, with the goal of turning Vegas into something more glamorous. After he passed away in 1976, the company shifted focus to real estate and casinos. In mid-1983, John Goulsbury, president and CEO of the Howard Hughes Corporation, called the team from Wet 'n Wild. He didn't think the time was right to build another casino. He wanted a water park. George Millet hadn't planned to build another park so soon, with Arlington having been open for less than a year, but he decided to go ahead anyway. This third park would turn out to be the final domestic US Wet 'n Wild that would involve original creator George Millet. Vegas wanted to attract families and try and shake the Disneyland for adults perception that the city had. Many Vegas gaming industry officials were convinced after the national recession of the late 70s and early 80s that the city needed to attract more tourists. They realized that the most profitable gaming operator during the previous few years was family-focused Circus. They hoped and saw the opportunity to expand the tourism market and anticipated more than 500,000 visitors would come to the new water park within its first year, steadily increasing in the years that followed. The company didn't want to compete with Disneyland or Knott's Berry Farm, as most of the visitors to Vegas were from Southern California, where those parks were located. Rather than a theme park, the idea of a water park seemed perfect. What could go better with the dry, hot weather that the city saw for half of the year?
Okay, people, you're looking for a picture-perfect time, right? Lots of, without a lotta. Well, thank goodness for Wet 'n Wild. Wet 'n Wild has acres and acres of ride, slides, shoots, floats, and flumes like the Black Hole. A twisting, turning torrent of time travel, the only ride of its kind in the world. And right now, you can get $5 off an all-day admission or half off after 3 p.m. when you bring your Nevada ID. We're talking Wet 'n Wild, big savings, and lots of fun. And all of it all the way till 8 p.m. Get the picture, Wet 'n Wild on the Las Vegas Strip.
The deal made between the two companies was that Wet n Wild would own 20% of the park and operate it for 4% of the gross profit. They would design, build, and market the park, and the Howard Hughes Corporation would put in nearly all of the money. Specifically, the Wet n Wild company would put in $1 million into the project, while the Howard Hughes Corporation would put in $15 million, with more available if needed. They wanted to build the most beautiful water park in the United States, and had a landscaping budget of nearly $1.5 million to do so. Original park designer George Walsh would head up the design team, using many of the people who had worked on both previous Wet n Wild parks. They also wanted an experienced construction team, and the work was done with a partnership from Harper, who had built the Arlington Park, along with Morrison Knudsen, who had built major infrastructure throughout the world, including the NASA Vehicle Assembly Building at Kennedy Space Center. Located on 26 acres of land between the Sahara and El Rancho hotels on the north end of the Strip at 2601 Las Vegas Boulevard, Wet n Wild Vegas was expected to be a boon to the local economy, offering an attractive alternative for visitors to the city. This site was chosen as it was less than a block away from Circus Circus and the Hilton Children's Hotel. More than 7,800 hotel rooms were within 3 blocks that catered to younger families. John Goolsby hoped that they had the quality and versatility within this upcoming park that would have considerable appeal to the family audience, and start the path to enhance the image of Las Vegas as an attractive, family-orientated destination. George Millay called it a desert wonderland, a place that would be the gold standard for water parks all over the world. Wet n Wild Las Vegas was an extremely beautiful park. It would feature a huge 500,000-gallon surf lagoon with simulated 4-foot-high ocean-sized waves in a 170-foot-long pool generated by 3 turbine engines. It had a giant water playground that included a 1930s-style Zeppelin, games, and other unique fun for the whole family. Favorite slides from other parks would come to Vegas. Der Stuka had riders free fall 76 feet down the slide with a 70-degree angle drop on the, at the time, fastest water chute ride in the world. The park advertised it as an experience just like being in a World War II German dive bomber. Stay classy, Vegas. The lazy river allowed guests to lounge on rafts, drifting along at 2 miles per hour on a 10-minute trip around the lagoon. Bonsai Boggan, which the park called a water roller coaster, had you lug heavy rafts up many stairs. This was later changed so they were taken up on a mechanism. Another hit slide was the Raging Rapids in a tube ride, fun for the whole family. The park heavily promoted the areas of picnic grounds where visitors could bring their own food and enjoy it in the beautiful surroundings on the Vegas Strip. Construction began in September 1984, and everything went smoothly. Anything the Wet n Wild company wanted, the Howard Hughes Corporation provided. The brand new water park opened on May 18, 1985, with 1,000 guests invited to a champagne breakfast and a dedication ceremony. Robert Goulet sang the Star-Spangled Banner, and of course, there was an Elvis impersonator present.
He's talking about Wet n Wild. In 1985, News 3 got a sneak preview a few days before the water park opened.
The highlight of the theme park is here at the Der Stuka, where bathers have an opportunity to free fall 76 feet. Now, it may not look too high from down here, but up there, it's a whole different story.
Open seasonally, the early months seemed promising for the new attraction, with projections expected to exceed the goal of 500,000 visitors. Vegas, however, would be a tough market to crack. While locals were coming to visit the water park, tourists were not. They were more interested in gambling, shows, and alcohol. Many of the hotels on the Strip not owned by the Hughes Corporation were not interested in sending people to Wet n Wild Vegas. In Orlando and Arlington, hotels were clamoring to make deals and send visitors to the park. This would be the first time Wet n Wild was surprised by how unwelcome they were to the Strip. While the tourists were not coming, the locals loved Wet n Wild. Whatever the park did though, advertising, billboards, radio promotions, the tourists just did not want to come. The park wasn't a failure, but it was the locals that kept it going. While it didn't meet the projections, it did make money. Every few years, the park would add a new slide or attraction with a capital expenditure of around $500,000. A bomb drop hatch was added to Der Stuka. Blue Niagara, the 300-foot intertwined tube slide, was a rough but fun addition. The Black Hole was added in 1992, taking an inflatable tube with a rider on a 30-second descent on a 528-foot-long slide through fiber optic star fields and galaxy patterns. Royal Flush was a bowl slide that could reach speeds of 45 miles per hour. Willy Willy had riders in a tube spinning around in a whirlpool at 10 miles per hour. The Willy Willy tune is incredibly catchy.
Wild's new Willy Willy. Jump in once, you'll come around.
It was actually named after Australian whirlwinds, not a guy doing the helicopter with his Willy Willy. Many of the offerings added to the park have been a hit at the other Wet n Wild properties previously, and remained a hit in Vegas. The park continued at a steady attendance and profit throughout the 90s. Changes came with the ownership of the park when the Howard Hughes Corporation wanted out. They had sold their hotels and wanted Wet n Wild Inc. to run and now own the park, and Howard Hughes Corporation would become the landlords, rather than the stockholder. The original deal was renegotiated. This new deal wasn't in Wet n Wild's favour, and the Howard Hughes Corporation began earning more money just owning the land than Wet n Wild Inc., when attendance in the park did pick up. The park was close to making $500,000 a season, with attendance eventually reaching the projection and topping out around 600,000 visitors a year. The lease would later pass to Santa Fe Gaming. Rumours began to circulate that the park was part of the deal to be sold with the Sahara, and that it would close. It wasn't, and the park continued to add attractions and events such as Summer Nights, a celebration featuring live music, contests, and games.
We'll knock $5 off admission. Did I mention the games, giveaways, and live music? Look, get off your couch, get into your swimsuit, and get over to Summer Nights at Wet n Wild on the Las Vegas Strip. I mean, we are priced to move.
In 1996, George Millet began to realistically look at the company's long-term potential. The lease payments in around 10 years at both parks were going to become an issue, tripling in price. The biggest factor in the sale, however, was the Orlando Flex ticket. Wet n Wild for many years had partnered with SeaWorld and Universal Studios on a multi-park, multi-day ticket that was extremely popular, bringing in a predictable amount of revenue. Wet n Wild Orlando's park was getting over 40% of its attendance from this one ticket. Universal and SeaWorld each received about 40% of the profit from the ticket, and Wet n Wild around 20%. With Universal building Islands of Adventure, SeaWorld building Discovery Cove, and Busch Gardens trying to get in on the Flex ticket, the slice of the profit from the ticket was about to be split further, and some suspected the promotion may end completely. Another suspicion was that George Millet believed that both SeaWorld and Universal Orlando would eventually enter the water park business for themselves. With very little space to expand in Orlando, the money-making park of the business, 3 years after selling Wet n Wild Arlington to Six Flags in 1995, the rest of the company, including all international franchising and rights, were sold. Wet n Wild first approached SeaWorld to see if they were interested in the park, but they declined. It would be Universal Studios that would purchase Wet n Wild Inc., including the Vegas park. Some believe that it will be Universal's first move to head into the gaming market in Vegas. They're thinking there had to be more to this than just buying a water park. Perhaps they would make a bid to buy the leased land under the site and the nearby vacant El Rancho site. When asked, they said they had no interest in gaming in Vegas. There were too many strip hotels chasing too few customers. They also had no plans to operate a water park in Vegas, and only had eyes for the Orlando park. At the time, the most visited water park in the United States, with more than 1 million visitors annually. The following year, they sold Wet n Wild Vegas and the international rights to New York-based Ogden Corporation, who had recently purchased Silver Springs in Florida. They immediately used the new rights to rename Emerald Point in North Carolina to use the Wet n Wild brand. Ogden originally planned to split its company into two, but those plans were scrapped. Shortly after, they announced they would focus more on their energy business rather than their aviation and entertainment sector of the company and sold the water parks. Greek company Alpha Smart Parks purchased Wet n Wild Vegas along with 14 other properties for $148 million, marking the Greek company's entry into the US theme and water park industry. Some of the 14 include Castle Park, Silver Springs, Wild Waters, and Raging Waters. They would later open Jazzland in New Orleans. Alpha would be the fourth owner of Wet n Wild Vegas within 19 months. Within 2 years, Alpha Smart Parks declared bankruptcy. All of the parks were then purchased in 2002 by Palace Entertainment, headed by former Six Flags president and George Millay's longtime friend, Larry Cochran.
Call or stop by your local Domino's Pizza today and enjoy great savings at Wet n Wild. Buy a hot and delicious Domino's Pizza and get coupons for $2 off regular admission or half-price admission after 4.
Palace Entertainment would now own 28 family entertainment parks and 9 water parks in the United States. Palace said the reason for the purchase was that Wet n Wild is a great park with a great history, as well as a great location on the Strip. They said we like to buy good parks in good locations, and then come in with the whipped cream and sprinkles that make it an even more special place for families to come to. They also said they would not make any immediate changes and keep on the 30 year-round and 200 to 300 seasonal workers at Wet n Wild. Less than a year later, unknown to Palace Entertainment, in 2003, plans were approved for a $650 million 50-story hotel, casino, and a 600-foot tall Ferris wheel, built directly on the Wet n Wild site called the Voyagers Hotel. It would also include a man-made lake with 20 yachts permanently moored on it because, you know, Vegas. The park's future didn't look promising, as the landowners had other ideas for the site. Managers of Wet n Wild stated that they had not been notified of any development plans for the site, and until they heard something, they were proceeding as normal. Wet n Wild reopened, even though talk was ongoing in the media about the upcoming project. Shortly after these plans were announced, they were dropped. Vegas has one complete, one half-built, and multiple scrapped Ferris wheels. That has to be a record, right? A new 10-year lease was signed for Wet n Wild, giving hope to fans of the park. David Loudon, real estate projects director for Sahara Las Vegas, an owner of the land, said the extension is an agreement that allows either side to terminate the deal with 6 months' notice. While he had no confirmed plans now for the site, he had a letter of intent that someone wanted to develop it. Palace Entertainment carried on as normal, even adding a new attraction built by ProSide. Called Dragon's Den, riders would shoot down a 45-foot drop, spinning through the mist of a dragon's den, featuring a 9-foot mist-breathing dragon. It also came to multiple other Palace Entertainment water parks. The new addition would cost $800,000, one of the biggest investments in the park's history. President of Palace Entertainment said Wet n Wild is a very important park in our system. Dragon's Den expresses our commitment to Wet n Wild's continuous operation and growth in the Las Vegas area. Wet n Wild Vegas was still reaching around 500 to 600,000 visitors a year, 80% of which were locals. This new lease, though, was short-lived. The owners of the land cut it short just 7 months after it had been extended. They planned to proceed with their new money-making resort named Palace of the Sea. They decided they no longer wanted to share that profit with Wet n Wild, and a resort would be much more profitable. The park was notified in late 2004 that the landowners were redeveloping the site. While many reports in the media stated it may happen, this was the first official communication with the park. Wet n Wild Las Vegas closed forever on September 26, 2004, after 20 seasons, leaving the original Orlando Park as the only remaining operating George Millay Park in the United States.
When we moved here, this was one of the things we looked at, just because it had so much for the kids to do. But we hope, they said that they might build. That's what we're hoping for.
Its final day was jammed full of visitors saying goodbye, many of which had spent countless summers at the water park. Most of the park slides were relocated to other Palace Entertainment properties. Anything that wasn't relocated was left abandoned in the lot until over a year later, the majority of the park was demolished. Santa Fe Gaming, now named Archon, decided to sell the land instead for $450 million, as they were losing money at the time and were not going to continue with their original resort project. After the sale, the land was now planned to become home to a skyscraper resort known as Crown Las Vegas, estimated to cost $5 billion. The 1,887-foot tall resort would be the tallest building in the United States. After the plans were declined and 2 redesigns, the project was cancelled. Once again, the former site of Wet n Wild found itself up for sale. The next planned development was to be a 20,000-seat stadium. It was again rejected. In 2013, nearly a decade after the water park had closed, it was again envisioned to be the all-net resort and arena, a $1.4 billion hotel, arena and shopping project designed to attract the NBA to Vegas. The project claimed to have the funds in hand, and that construction would be complete by 2022. Nothing has yet happened. 17 years after Wet n Wild Vegas was closed to make way for a resort, the site still sits empty and abandoned today. Wet n Wild Vegas on the Strip was loved by those who visited. A beautiful, fun, and exciting water park that locals had been visiting for many years to cool off from the heat of the desert. When it closed, it left many people disappointed. And what makes it worse is that nothing ever did replace it. The water park was a place that was once called an aquatic Disneyland, home for many Vegas families and children of the 80s and 90s. It was built to be the first major non-gaming attraction for tourists, but it was the locals of the area that allowed Wet n Wild Vegas to operate for as long as it did, many of which made lifelong memories of one of the best original water parks ever built. The large, open spaces, landscaping, huge pools, and picnic areas became a staple of Vegas summers. When the park was forced to close, Palace Entertainment didn't rule out remaking the park in another location. They said if it would happen, it likely wouldn't be on the Strip due to the cost. The Wet n Wild name would return to the city, this time with an extra apostrophe, and operated by a completely different company. Wet n Wild with 2 apostrophes, located in Spring Valley, would open in May 2013, a water park that is not connected to the original in any way. Australian-based entertainment company Village Roadshow opened the park with the brand originating from Wet n Wild Waterworld on the Gold Coast. Their original park was called Wet n Wild with 2 apostrophes, after agreeing a licensing deal with the original chain led by George Millay in 1987. That extra apostrophe makes all the difference in Wet n Wild branding, and it is the newer brand which is more prominent today. The only operating water parks using the original branding are Emerald Point, Wet n Wild Cancun, and Wet n Wild in Brazil. This newer Vegas park is a much more modern offering for a water park that is completely different from the original on the Strip. Wet n Wild Vegas was a water park that was the first to try and capitalize on the success of a family-friendly Vegas, inspired by the profits of Circus Circus. The 90s would take Family Vegas to the next level, with places like MGM Grand Adventure, the Luxor, Treasure Island Pirate Battle, and many more. Many of these family-orientated attractions were full of grand ideas, hopeful profit, and a new way to bring in visitors while attempting to transform the image of Sin City. The story of Wet n Wild Vegas is a sad one, a water park that was designed for tourists, but became a success due to the locals of Las Vegas who spent summers there. Just another place like so many that offered family fun yet closed for an idea that would bring bigger profits. In this case, profits that would never come. Wet n Wild Las Vegas was sadly closed for no real reason at all. Thank you so much for watching this episode of Expedition Extinct. If you enjoyed it, make sure you subscribe to join the expedition. Follow us on Twitter and Instagram for updates on upcoming expeditions. And a special thank you to our Patreons for supporting the channel. Where would you like to head on the next expedition? Let me know in the comments below. We will see you next time. It isn't a Vegas expedition without Lance somewhere.
I was stupid. I was really stupid.